Good morning. I am glad to be here this morning with you. And our first reading this morning comes from a friend of mine. Chris Alvarez is an English teacher in Seattle, and he's one of the best writers that I know. He often makes me a little jealous when I read the things that he writes. He posted this to Facebook earlier this week, a spontaneous poem he wrote called Ave Thriftway, sort of a play on Ave Maria, but Ave Thriftway, a hail to the people who have kept us fed throughout the pandemic. Ave Thriftway. Grocery store workers of America, thank you for being there through the pandemic, for giving us a place to get out of the house when nothing else was open. It's true that food is needed for the body, but what about the soul? That grows in company, face to face, elbow to elbow, out in the open, while other fruit rotted on the vine, movie theaters, baseball stadiums, the opera, your aisles of food sustained us. One-way arrows on the floor pointing towards salvation, the last box of life-giving checks, a Eucharist of cream wafers. You spilled out life like seeds from a split melon, the weekly chat with the guy stacking apples. Hey, take these, they are the freshest. And what about the value of patience? Because during a pandemic, not everything can stay in stock, even in America. Do you have the SodaStream carbonation canisters? Not for the next month at least, try Amazon. Do you have the SodaStream carbonation canisters? Not yet. Have you tried Bed Bath & Beyond? Any word on those SodaStream canisters? Let me call the back for you. No, that's okay, I wanna leave. And then one fine day, 3 cases of LaCroix on the belt. It'll be nice when those SodaStream canisters come back in. We have them. When the mainspring on which everything depends is suddenly wrenched out, that which makes everything appear alive collapses into rubble, and only a spirit of simplicity and goodness can breathe new beauty, if only through plexiglass at checkout. So thank you for standing valiantly in front of automated doors, fully masked, thanking us for coming and keeping us fed. Our Bible reading for this morning is from the Gospel of John, chapter 20. This story comes around every year around this time. We often focus on central character of Thomas, who is in this story, but maybe it's a story for all of us as well. And the story begins on Easter Day. It says, when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the temple authorities, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw him. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As Abba God has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven them. If you retain their sins, they are retained." But Thomas, who's called the twin, he's one of the 12, he was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, the disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the child of God, that through believing you may have life in his name. This is God's good news. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. That is the traditional Easter greeting and response. And some of you, I know, do that like a reflex because it is deep inside of you, just waiting to be called out. Someone says, Christ is risen this time of year, and you just know it spontaneously. Christ is risen indeed. It's the second Sunday of Easter, and that is the appropriate greeting and response. One of my favorite stories about it, though, is Linda's story, which some of you have heard, from when she was working as a hospice chaplain, and her boss, the hospice director, came in all excited on Easter Monday, the day after, and had that greeting right on her tongue. Christ is risen, her boss said, to which Linda replied, which seems also to be an appropriate response. It's the second Sunday of Easter. It's also the second Sunday of Easter in pandemic. I don't mean to suggest that Linda's old hospice director was being unreasonably cheerful in the face of reality, or that she was exhibiting what Priscilla refers to as toxic positivity. Take it at face value as a sincere and deeply felt expression of faith. Still, on this second Sunday of Easter in a pandemic, feels entirely reasonable. It might have felt that way in the Bible reading too, after Mary Magdalene showed up and started telling fantastical stories. Today's reading, like I said, it comes around on the second Sunday of Easter every year. Sometimes we read it in church and sometimes we don't. And the story starts on Easter evening. It hits home in a new way for me this year. I know we're not particularly fearful of temple authorities or the Roman Empire's machinery of death any longer, but I can't be the only one who found it deeply familiar that the disciples would be shut away behind locked doors because the outside world felt threatening. I'll also admit to a new experience in reading this story in the context of present realities. This is John's version of the Pentecost story, which reads very differently in the book of Acts. Instead of happening during a public festival, and instead of involving heads of flame and speaking in other languages, this version involves Jesus showing up in a locked room and breathing on the disciples. I have an irreverent streak, some of you know that. So this is not the first time I have imagined that 3 days in a tomb made that experience less than minty fresh. But never before have I found myself stopping dead in my tracks at this part of the story to say, "Good Lord, put on your mask." Reading the Bible during a pandemic is weird, or at least it has created new entry points for us to imagine ourselves into the story and to imagine the story into us. If it felt familiar that the disciples spent Easter as a social pod shut inside behind locked doors, it may also have felt familiar when the story moved forward to the following week, the second Sunday of Easter, and that sacred social pod of disciples was once again shut away inside behind locked doors. Something big is afoot in the story, but how do you process that? And what does it call you to? This is our second Sunday of Easter in a pandemic. Many of us have spent the better part of the past year shut inside. We've limited our exposure to people who aren't in our households. We've worn masks. We've done our best to stay 6 feet away from other people or more. For many of us, this has been a necessity and a burden, but also a strange privilege because we have had the capacity to alter our patterns, to work remotely, to maintain income. And something feels different now in these moments, Easterish even. Some of us are completely vaccinated. Some of us are halfway there. Others of us have appointments or trust that they will be forthcoming. We can feel maybe that the gravestone is about to be rolled away or is in the process of being rolled away. But it also all still feels so tentative. How do you celebrate Easter when it still feels like Holy Saturday? There are many more people for whom this has all played out differently in the first place. People who lost work, people who lost their lives or whose loved ones did, people living now in grief. Students who lost the instruction and the regular human interaction that happens in the classroom. People who have gone out every day to work at jobs where they're in regular contact with other people who are not their household members and whose health status and commitment to protecting themselves and others is unknown, or whose lack of commitment to that is all too visible. Grocery store workers, doctors, nurses, home health aides, mail carriers, and other people making deliveries, hospice workers, funeral workers, sanitation workers. There are folks who put up signs of gratitude to essential workers outside of their homes, and some folks who still bang pots and pans in tribute. But we should also be honest about so many of those essential workers being offered as tribute to shareholder profits. Perhaps we are not so far from the Roman Empire's machinery of death after all. We're at an in-between moment. The vaccines keep coming. We've got new leadership, but many of the same systems remain. We're still behind locked doors. How do we claim Easter? I'm struck by the fact that in the story, it's not so much that the disciples claimed Easter as that Easter claimed them. Jesus walked through the doors and said, peace. That's important. Last week, Linda preached about Jesus rising again in us, in community, and how we can go out to be truth tellers and signs of Easter in the world. That's a powerful reminder and something to keep close to heart. We should also, I want to say, be on the lookout for Easter showing up to us, walking through the doors of our weariness and our wariness, of our fatigue and anxiety and despair, and speaking peace. One of the ways that I've been trying to keep my head straight this past year of living behind locked doors has been to walk my neighborhood. Fresh air and movement are a tonic of sorts. I think I've nearly worn a groove in the pavement on my block and along a stretch of Johnson Street, which marks the boundary between Germantown and Mount Airy. The other morning, I was on one of my walkabouts when I rounded the corner from Johnson onto Green Street and was absolutely gobsmacked by a magnolia tree in full bloom. It had been in bloom all week, and for the second time in as many days, it stopped me dead in my tracks, its branches outstretched like an invitation to embrace, so thick with flowers I dreamt of crawling in for a nap, and who knows what dreams might have come then. There was a young woman that morning coming the other direction from me. We had the same thought at the same moment, each of us pulling out our phone for that singular act of futility, trying to capture the real life dazzle in a way we'd appreciate later. When we realized also at the same moment what had just happened, I looked at her and I said the dumbest and most obvious thing that came to mind. This tree is gorgeous. Her eyes widened and she said, I know, I was just saying, this tree is so gorgeous. Oh my goodness. We just shared the briefest moment of joy bursting out from us on the sidewalk there. And our masks could not hide the fact that our faces were split open like resurrection. Jesus, alive and well, out on the sidewalk in Germantown. And Jesus was alive and well at the UPS store in Chestnut Hill the other day, calling me hun and singing along as New Edition played on the stereo. And resurrection was happening at the Laya Chorus Center a couple weeks ago, and wherever the Black Doctors COVID-19 Consortium has been this week, getting shots into arms and helping close the racial disparity in vaccinations. All around us is what I'm saying. No matter the signs to the contrary, whether we're feeling more open and alive or still stuck behind closed doors, Jesus shows up with a word of peace. Christ is risen. Christ is rising, indeed. This is God's good news. Amen.